Thank you, Christy. I think I'm gonna have to do that. Okay, I'm gonna just, before I get started, start out with a little video. All right, now how this video has to do with, oops, I keep trying to pause it here. Okay, operator fatigue. First of all, it probably shows Europe is way, way better at promoting bus travel than the United States. Oh, I forgot the microphone. The bus drivers were portrayed as typically a lot cooler than they are here, even though I know for a fact, because I work with thousands of bus drivers over the last several years, that bus drivers can be very cool, but that's unfortunately not represented very often in the US. And for the most part, we're probably going to have to admit that this video doesn't really have anything to do with operator fatigue, but this is an hour-long session, so I thought I would start out with something that would arrest your attention. The idea that operator fatigue is a perennial problem, most people accept that even if you've never been attached to bus operations in your life. How many of you have ever been involved in an accident or a near accident, or know somebody involved in an accident or a near accident due to operator fatigue, driving fatigue, either yourself or someone you know? I include someone you know because a lot of people won't admit that they themselves have almost crashed into a median because they were drowsy. When I was in college many years ago, me and my then wife decided that it was a good idea to have a child while I was in college full-time and working full-time. And it turned out that they were twins, which was, as you might suspect, very unplanned. And so the twins were born, a boy and a girl, fairly early, about 10 weeks early. And they were in the NICU for a long time, had a lot of problems when they came home. And somehow, for some reason, and we never got a definitive answer on why this occurred, they never slept at the same time, like ever. And so I went, I want to say 2 years with 1 to 2 hours of sleep a night. I was not in transportation, thank God, at that time. However, working full-time, going to school full-time, trying to do that, trying to help in the nights, I started suffering some pretty severe fatigue. I was a fairly fit person at that time, early 20s. And I did pretty well the first few months, I want to say, giving myself a little pat on the back. But after a time, it started to wear on me. And there were several instances of nearly falling asleep, having to pull over at like a freeway exit because I had to commute to work and take a short nap. And so the idea of like fatigue for drivers became a very personal thing for me. Fast forward several years, and I'm in bus operations training at Utah Transit Authority, and I'm teaching 3 classes that are kind of primer classes for brand new operators. And one of the things that we teach is fatigue. And so I had a very personal relationship to fatigue and what to do about fatigue from the get-go. Now, when it comes to fatigue, I'm just going to do a quick rundown of fatigue as a phenomenon, and then we'll get into like operators specifically and what we can do about fatigue, because it's a very serious problem. 2 types of fatigue are physical and mental. They're very related to one another. They're not in completely separate boxes, but there are some differences, right? You can be physically fatigued but mentally alert. That's definitely possible. And you can also be mentally fatigued, but physically you're not doing too bad, right? Obviously, when both of those combine, it becomes particularly dangerous. But there's different solutions for different kinds of fatigue. So if you have mental fatigue, there's a typical response to that, and if you have physical fatigue, there's a typical response to that. When you break down fatigue a little bit further, you can divide it into these categories. There's acute chronic fatigue, and there's drowsiness, which is a slightly separate category. Chronic, let me start with acute fatigue. Acute fatigue is something literally every human experiences, right? It's what you feel after anything that exhausts the energy that you currently have. So someone that runs a race, even a short race, will experience acute fatigue. And the main marker for acute fatigue is that it's short term, right? You rest a little bit, maybe you hydrate, and you're feeling basically back to normal. Chronic fatigue is typically diagnosed as an actual medical problem, and it's when no matter what you seem to do, you can't stop feeling far more tired than you think you should, right? It's very subjective, but in this case, the subjective is actually pretty accurate. So if you yourself are determining that you're just too tired all the time and it doesn't seem to matter what you do, now you have to be honest with yourself. Are you doing fairly normal, regular things to not be so tired? Like, are you getting a certain number of hours of sleep? Do you have like a minimum amount of exercise? Is your diet not absolutely atrocious? Like those sorts of things. And if you still feel extremely exhausted all the time, you probably have some aspect of chronic fatigue. There's several disorders that have to do with chronic fatigue, okay? And then there's drowsiness, which is a form of acute fatigue, which you can be very, very tired, very exhausted, and not necessarily sleepy, right? Drowsiness is a particular form of fatigue, and people typically experience it, they become aware of it in like settings like this, for example. You're in a classroom, you're sitting for a long period of time, you're nodding off, you're becoming drowsy, right? Of course, the other setting in which people are going to notice drowsiness is driving. And if you've driven for more than a few months in your life, you probably have experienced at least a little bit of drowsiness when you're driving. Because it doesn't just happen on long trips, it doesn't just happen late at night. It can happen after particular things that you do and at certain times of the day. And we'll talk about that a little bit more later. Okay? Some basic signs of fatigue, and this is in general, this is not just for drivers. We need to start kind of broadly and then get down to what the deal is with people driving with fatigue. Chronic tiredness or sleepiness, we kind of discussed that. A persistent headache. Now, obviously, all of these things could be related to fatigue, but also have other sources too. Like your headache could be because you just got done at a really loud concert, for example. Doesn't necessarily have to be because you're fatigued. Dizziness, sore or aching muscles, muscle weakness. Now, the sore or aching muscles is probably a sign that you're extremely fatigued. Not just a basic sign of fatigue, but sore and aching muscles is you haven't slept enough, you haven't rested enough. Slowed reflexes and responses, impaired decision-making and judgment, and moodiness, such as irritability. Okay? Now, some specific signs of drowsiness. And again, if you've experienced drowsiness when driving, this is particularly obvious. Yawning, frequent blinking, your head nodding off, drifting out of your lane, missing an exit, having to turn around, running over the rumble strip. There's a reason why there's a rumble strip. It's almost entirely because of drowsy drivers that there's a rumble strip. Well, drowsy drivers and distracted drivers. And we'll talk about distraction in just a minute. And then difficulty remembering the past few miles driven. Difficulty remembering the last few minutes could be a sign of drowsiness and fatigue. It could also be related to something completely different. Okay? Now, there's a lot of overlap with fatigue and distracted driving, right? Because fatigue is a form of distracted driving. Distracted driving typically means you're taking your eyes off the road, your hands off the wheel, and your mind is going elsewhere. Now, you could be alert and experiencing these things because you're looking at your phone, you're applying makeup, you're trying to eat a 4-course meal, something along those lines while you're driving. But when you're extremely fatigued and drowsy, these things will also be part of that process, right? So you can think of fatigue as a form of distracted driving. To the extent that distracted driving is a problem, and we typically talk about activities that drivers do that distract them, fatigue has to be included in that, right? And it's a lot more subtle because people don't think of it as, hey, look, I'm 10 and 2 on the wheel, and I'm like driving the speed limit, I'm doing all these things, and yet if you're really fatigued, it doesn't matter that you're doing all those things because these things can still happen. Okay? Little bit of statistics. Now I'm going to start out with statistics for drivers in general, of which, of course, we all are, whether you're an operator or not. Operators, of course, meet these statistics as well as actual operator statistics, since they're also drivers of their own personal vehicles. That's important to understand and remember, especially as an operator. I will talk to operators fairly regularly who say, hey, doing this job, training, all of that really stuck, because now I occasionally still stop at railroad crossings in my own little Hyundai, and I remember I'm not in the bus. So I'm actually a much safer driver because I've gone through this experience as an operator. An estimated 17% of fatal crashes from 2017 to 2021 involved a drowsy driver, resulting in nearly 30,000 deaths during that period. 1 in 5 fatal crashes involve driver fatigue worldwide. So it's a major, major cause, obviously. And unlike drugs and alcohol, fatigue is something that can hit anyone at any time, just depending on the circumstances of their personal lives. Approximately 6,400 annual deaths in the US result from crashes involving drowsy driving. And 37% of US workers sleep less than 7 hours, reducing alertness and increasing driving impairment risks. Now that has actually gone down, meaning the average number of hours slept over the last 30 years or so, it used to be closer to 8 hours. It's gone down to 7 hours. And there's a lot of studies and speculations about why this has happened. One is just the fervent of technology, right? Like what screens actually do to our brains, what flashing lights and video images and quick cuts and things like that, loud noises, etc., how they work on the brain over time. Okay, so just kind of the culture in general, how we've become kind of more of a screen-attached culture, is also tied to sleeping less. And the kind of sleep that you do get is often less quality sleep because of that. That's why you'll sometimes hear like a doctor might say, you should not look at a screen like an hour before you go to bed, because that's going to activate like certain parts of the brain that will try to keep you active as you try to fall asleep. And a lot of people, of course, end up either taking some sort of like a sleeping pill to help them sleep, or they end up just getting up and having a much less restive period of sleep when they finally do go to bed, right? Obviously, this is a much more serious thing when it comes to workers that have to deal with safety issues. If you're someone like me who stands in front of a classroom or sits in front of a computer for the job, the safety risks are obviously much, much less than if you're driving a big rig or a commercial vehicle, right? So the 37% of workers here obviously is going to also involve workers that work with dangerous equipment, safety-related jobs. Okay? This is something that has long been talked about, I think, in transportation circles, especially among drivers and supervisors of drivers. 17 hours awake equals 0.05 blood alcohol content impairment. 24 hours awake equals 0.10 BAC. And that varies per person, right? Some people can be awake for longer due to many different kinds of factors, and these are typically people on the younger side that are able to be awake with less of an impairment problem, but no one can be awake a full 24 hours and not be fairly impaired, almost certainly too impaired to drive, right? So sleep, we've known this for a long, long time, but this really kind of sharpens the reason why sleep is so important, because it can affect your body in the same way that alcohol consumption can affect your body. And those people that deal with safety-related industries, obviously this is an extremely critical thing for the successful, for those jobs in those industries. Okay, all right, let's talk about bus operator fatigue in particular. When I typically see bus operators right after their first orientation at UTA. So there's like a organizational orientation that everybody has to go through. And then they get sent to us in bus operations training. Now, when about 6 years ago, I was looking for something different, something like additional than what I was doing. I had been teaching in higher education for a long time, but it had been like peaks and valleys. I was looking for something a little more stable. And a friend of mine, who was a planner at UTA at the time, said, hey, why don't you come over here? They usually are hiring bus operators, and he checks the website. He's like, yep, they're hiring right now. And you might like that. And with your background, you might end up finding something else in the organization if you stick around. Why don't you try it? And I said, that is completely different from anything I've ever done. Yes, I will do that. I was actually kind of excited to do something different. So I got hired as a fixed route operator, and I got my Class B license. And the first 2 weeks of training, I remember just being an absolute zombie. Now, part of that is because, just a shift in your schedule, period, right? When you change from doing something all the time to doing something even a little bit different, it can sap your energy until you adapt, right? But the other thing was the actual schedule of an operator, it was difficult, right? I was preparing for the CDL test, and then I was starting to learn routes, bus technology, all these ADA issues, right? And your brain, even if you sit in a class all day, there's a reason why you're so tired at the end of it. And that's because absorbing information, trying to pay attention, trying to process what you're learning is very energy consuming. You burn calories literally by absorbing information, by thinking. And so by the end of a class, you're tired, even though you haven't moved at all. Think about when you're driving. When a bus driver drives in particular, what does a bus driver have to do? Well, they have to drive the bus like anyone has to drive their car. There's certain things that are specific to the bus, obviously. But your scenery is changing every single second. Your mind is processing all this stuff at an unconscious level, typically, right? On top of that, you got to know your routes. You got to understand the technology that you're working with, the navigational system. You got to be on the lookout for customers at bus stops, including at night when the bus stops, when the customers, are pretty much in stealth mode, and you have to look out for them. You have to look out for the typical hazards that a driver has to look out for. Then you have to deal with various issues around ADA, around belligerent customers, around talking to dispatch when necessary. There's like 100 different things that you got to be thinking about as a bus operator. And I would tell students when they would come in the first time, I was like, look, we've had people say, I can't do this job, it's too exhausting, and quit. But I'm telling you, you give it 2 weeks, you will feel differently by the end of that. And that was typically the case, right? Because you adapt to those sorts of things. Even when you adapt, the fatigue is still an issue, right? You don't become completely immune to all that energy expenditure. All of the brain work that your brain is doing, even though you're just sitting in a seat all day long, is absolutely enormous. In fact, I would say, even on an intellectual level, being a bus operator is like elite in that way. Driving a commercial vehicle, period, requires a lot more than driving a Class D vehicle, obviously. But being a bus operator and everything that you have to pay attention to, and the people that you have to interact with, and the improvisation you're required to constantly do on a daily basis, it adds up to a lot of energy expenditure. So operators that are not taking care of themselves in certain ways start to feel the cost of that on the back end fairly quickly. And they develop certain methods for coping with that. Some of those are good coping methods that are long-term. Others are very short-term, right? And have actually higher costs down the road. So let's look a little bit at the fatigue that bus operators in particular experience and the consequences of that. Collision rates increase notably after operators have 3 consecutive days off work. Why do you think that is? If you're an operator, have you ever experienced this? And what do you think, you guys? Why would that be?
Maybe I enjoy my days off a little bit too much. I don't stand schedule.
Yeah, okay. That's one thing, right? You don't want to be so scheduled on your days off, and so you might not be getting the rest that you normally require of yourself for your work days. That's a really good possibility. Anything else? Any other speculations?
I usually just put down getting rusty really fast.
Yeah. Yes, right? Your body is now adapting to a new schedule. Now, it's obviously you don't have weeks off in this particular instance. We're talking about like a 3-day weekend, if there is such a thing. For operators, that's actually pretty rare. But let's assume that you take vacation, right, for 3 days. Even though your body's not fully adapted to whatever that new schedule is, it's still something new. And you're probably just beginning to adapt to this new way of living for 3 days by the time it's over and you got to hit the road again, right? Now you're back to having to adapt all over again. And that typically doesn't take a long time, but there is a transition period. And it's during that transition period that studies show that accidents often occur when they are related to cases of fatigue. Okay? Split shift schedules lead to longer work hours. Typically, approximately 13 hours on average. This is across the nation for operators on split shifts. And they lead to reduced sleep and increased fatigue. Now, when I first started working at UTA, when you start on what's called the extra board, and basically what you're doing is you're picking up schedules and shifts from regular drivers who are sick, on vacation, or there's not enough people to cover the routes. And so on the extra board, you work a split shift. Now, you're not allowed by law to work more than a certain number of hours a day or a week, but nevertheless, depending on where you live and what your situation is, you're having to get up extremely early in the morning. Sometimes you can take advantage of the split part of it to rest a little bit. That's not always possible, but then you're doing another shift in the afternoon, often into the evening. And so you're kind of in operator mode sometimes for between like 10 and 15 hours, depending on what the shift happens to be, right? Whereas someone who works a regular shift, even accounting for like commuting and things of that nature, And the difficulty of working 8 hours straight in a seat, studies show is not, those people are not typically as tired on as regular of a basis as people who work split shifts. And part of this, of course, is because with the split shift, even though you're literally only scheduled for certain numbers of hours to be driving, the way life works with travel and things of that nature is that in your brain, you're actually on the clock far longer than that, right? And there's certain things that you're doing that kind of lend to your work life, even though you're not necessarily being paid at that time. Does that make sense? So I remember experiencing this on split shift. I actually lived pretty far away from where I worked, and so my commute was pretty long. And so I couldn't go home in between shifts. And so I just had to kind of find a place to rest. At my particular unit, there wasn't really good resting digs. I ended up going to the library where it was kind of quiet. And the chairs weren't the best, but I could kind of nod off for a few minutes. It was not ideal. And I very quickly experienced the kind of fatigue that they're talking about here, doing a split shift. Okay? Obviously, peak accident times. Now, there's lots of reasons for accidents occurring at peak accident times, right? You have a lot more of the laws of physics in motion during peak accident times than you do at other times. There's a lot more cars on the road, a lot more potential for things to happen. But what also happens for a lot of people physically between the hours of 1 and 3 p.m.? What's going on then? A crash, yes, but why? Why are you extra fatigued typically during those hours? Middle of the day, okay, you've already worked. That's one reason. Say that again. Lunch, yes. Why? Shouldn't you have more energy now that you just had lunch? Yeah, there's certain chemical reactions, certain ways that food interacts with your body that produces drowsiness. And depending on what you eat too, right? If you're eating something like high in carbs and sugar, you're typically going to have a crash of some sort. And so for a lot of people, that's what happens to them, right? And for people who are on the road, not just for operators, but for people in general, they're obviously more prone to nodding off, to getting a little drowsy, to not being as alert as they otherwise would be. And obviously when it comes to people in the safety industry, like bus operators, that goes up way higher as a potential problem, okay? Now, why Wednesdays? Anyone have any guesses on that? Why Wednesday is a doom day? I see someone over here?
It's hump day.
Oh, it's hump day, so therefore what? Okay, yeah, okay. I'm interested in anyone's answers because I actually have no idea. I actually Googled this a little bit and I found a couple of things that weren't totally convincing to me, but I'm interested in hearing what people think. Yeah.
I would say it's emotional. Wednesdays, you've gotten as far into the week as you're going to get before you have something to start looking forward to.
Yeah, okay, good. Good.
I think Wednesdays is usually my busiest day. So I'm trying to handle all the things that have come up a couple of days before, and prepare for the couple of days after, before the weekend. And so usually on Wednesdays, I'm on the phone a lot more, I'm sending a lot more text messages, I'm trying to follow up on things that happened earlier in the week, prepare for the things later in the week.
Yeah.
Wednesdays for me are usually really busy.
Okay, yeah, that's totally valid. I'm going to suggest too, even though people famously often dread Mondays because they're going back to work for a lot of people. Now, for someone like on a bus operator schedule, you know, you may have worked Sunday, so Monday isn't like a special day or anything. But even if you don't like Mondays, even if you dread the Monday coming because the weekend is over, you typically have a certain kind of energy for your job when you come back to it that you didn't have on Friday, right? Even if you don't particularly like what you do. And what I'm going to suggest is that kind of just runs out by Wednesday. And people are looking at Friday and being like, where's Friday, right? Because the energy for that is just not there. And that can happen with like any industry. You have this energy and even maybe a little bit of enthusiasm, a little bit of motivation that kind of disappears by the middle of the week, assuming you work like a typical Monday through Friday sort of week, okay? 21%, now this is bus drivers reporting as opposed to like external objective studies. 21% of drivers report fatigue and reduced alertness due to split shift schedules. So when they've done studies in which they've asked bus drivers to do surveys and to self-report, usually anonymously, this is typically what they've said. And they've attributed it themselves to split shift schedules. Now, at the same time, that's obviously subjective, right? Split shift schedules are typically not popular. And not just because they're exhausting, but because they interrupt your life in various ways. So there's probably some bias that goes beyond fatigue against split shift schedules. And yet, because we've already seen the statistic with split shift schedules and how it relates to accidents and fatigue, there's some truth to it too, right? So 21% report that they have less alertness during those schedules. Now, I want to do a little breakout. And I want you to get into groups. Now, you're already kind of in groups, so I'm just going to suggest if 2 is the minimum. So as long as there's another person at your table, that's your group. But if you're totally alone, go to a table that can accommodate you. And it'll be just for the next couple of slides that we do this. So if pretty much everyone's already in place. I see a couple of people that are single. You need to find your cute little speed dating. Okay? And if you want to like shift around too, that's totally fine too. I just minimum of 2 people in a group for this little activity. Now, for this little activity, you're going to rely on your own personal experience as a driver, at minimum as a driver of a Class D vehicle, a regular driver. But those of you who have additional driving experience with Class A or Class B licenses or Class C licenses, obviously you can apply this to that as well, okay? And this is what we're going to do. It's going to be a discussion. I'm going to give you about 10 minutes. Actually, probably less than that at this point. I'll decide as we go. And what you're going to do is you're going to imagine that you are a group of supervisors. Okay, you supervise and support bus drivers. All the aspects of their job, including their schedules. And a series of accidents over the last few months has been attributed to driver fatigue specifically. So we're going to say that investigators at whatever level have reported to you in an official report that fatigue was a major cause of these last 6 months, the accidents of the last 6 months. How do you propose to deal with this problem? Okay, so I want you to come up with just some basic bullet points about what you would do, and obviously you don't have an unlimited budget, as supervisors never do, but at the same time, I don't want this to be like super budget focused, okay? In fact, probably the less things that cost a lot of money, the better. But what would you do like in the short term and the long term for your operators? And so you're kind of powwowing, brainstorming about this problem and what you're going to do at this point. Okay, so I'm going to give you a few minutes to do that.
How many drivers do we have?
Oh, you have like a driver, you're each assigned a driver, let's say, or a couple of drivers. Because some agencies have tons of drivers and some have just like 1 or 2, so. And you can actually assign the number of drivers you want to if you have this idea for like a larger group or a smaller group, it doesn't really matter. right, I'm going to give you 2 more minutes. All right, let's go ahead and wrap up. See if you've solved the operator fatigue problem in 5 minutes, thus disproving the need for meetings, which would be pretty amazing. So we'll see if that worked. So I'd like to just hear from a few volunteers in different groups what you discussed as potential solutions that you thought were pretty good, pretty likely to work in your humble opinion. You want to go first? Okay, good. Relief drivers at different points. Good. That's good. Anyone else? Okay, so breaks between shifts. Yeah, rotating. Okay, good. Excellent. So that's schedule based. Good.
A solution for everyone, but making sure there's a variety of routes that drivers can go on. So maybe one day it's a long day, another day it's a switch shift. But it's always thinking about instead of just doing the same rotating every single day.
Okay.
Some drivers do like that, maybe not. That's maybe.
Sure. Maybe a little bit of advance notice so you know what you're getting and prepare accordingly. Okay, good. Ryan.
So Karen, my partner, she gave a suggestion of if an operator isn't fit for duty, their fatigue, that the supervisor could take their first run, maybe that's 20 minutes, half an hour, allow them to go get some rest, and then allow them to continue their shift.
Okay. Good. I always like to hear about supervisor involvement for various reasons. Anyone else? We'll do one more. Christy.
So we were talking, but how I am is I would still probably do more of a deep dive of like, are there completely personal reasons that this is happening? When are these actions, that kind of thing.
Yeah.
Solutions, have a really good idea that he's done some research in different classes, but it's physical therapist. So exercise is shown to help with sleep, have sleep apnea and some things. It also can give you some energy. So if you can't get rid of split shifts, say for instance, and that's an issue, like at UTA we have gyms, we have exercise, gym passes also. So maybe that
And access to sleep studies with sleep apnea solutions. Yeah, because I was going to say I'm a beneficiary of exactly that because I have sleep apnea and had it when I was an operator and I got a machine for it and it helped a lot.
Oh, yeah.
So
Looking at those things, so those are pretty low cost options, right? That goes again back to maybe the supervisor. Like, is there someone on staff or is that going to be used to maybe do some lifestyle training?
yeah,
You
okay.
know, you go on the break room, you can supply better maybe food choices to try to encourage people not to get energy drinks, but to get energy in better ways so that hopefully it helps them not, it doesn't, the fatigue gets helped, not just made worse.
Sure, yeah. And actually I saw one other hand and then I'll move on.
Yeah, I would say when dealing with split shifts, when doing the schedule and trying to pair up one's
start earlier with ones that finish earlier to keep the amount of time first clock in to final clock out for the day as short as possible.
Okay, good. I like these ideas about schedule management, like creative schedule massaging, which scheduling is like its own math for any of you involved with scheduling. It's actually incredibly complicated and has to change on a dime and things of that nature. Okay, luckily there's so much to talk about that anything that I miss, I'll just be like, well, there wasn't enough time. So I want to see if I captured at least a few of the things you talked about, whether we're talking about the things that people said that when I asked for hands, or just the things that you discussed in your groups in general. These are general ways to avoid fatigue, okay, for most people. And that's about diet, exercise, water. I'll talk a little bit more about water in a minute. Water is actually quite important for battling fatigue. Not getting rid of caffeine entirely necessarily, but cutting down on its consumption, because too much caffeine can do various things to the body to exacerbate fatigue problems.
On the water, I mean, I have a question, because I don't know. I know how my body functions, so I'm getting older. And so if I were an operator, I would probably hardly drink anything, because I'm worried about having going to work.
Yeah.
You know what I'm saying? So
Yeah.
I guess what I'm asking is, how do you hydrate it? I don't have any idea.
I don't know on a broad spectrum, and of course I would just be talking about the operator I work with. But most of them actually carry a couple of water bottles with them. And there is like a company rule that you can stop at a public restroom in the middle of your shift if you need to use the restroom. So you're not required to like get to your EOL and then use the restroom. If you need to use the restroom, then you're allowed to do that.
However, you are too, though, right? They have that pressure all the time.
Oh yeah, there's all that still too. Yeah.
You could stop. You know what I mean? Like,
Yeah.
am I willing to stop, or do I need to?
Sure. Those are valid questions. Those are questions. Good. Drowsiness, kind of the same thing. Now here, paradoxically, there's drink a caffeinated beverage. But remember I said, you don't have to cut out caffeine entirely, but if you drink a lot of caffeine, obviously this is not going to give you any more energy by drinking yet a little more, right? So if you keep your caffeine consumption to like a fairly low level, then sometimes drinking a caffeinated beverage, depending on what you feel like when you drink caffeine, can be helpful for 2 or 3 hours. But if you drink a lot of caffeine, it's not really available to you as like a tool in the tool belt, okay? Let's talk about water really fast. Obviously, now you all have learned this when you were children, I'm sure, how much of your body weight is water. Water is super important for literally everything about your body, so it's kind of not a surprise that it might help with fatigue. And it's also not a surprise that the majority of Americans are underhydrated. Now, that doesn't mean they're under-liquefied. There's plenty of liquid getting consumed in America, but for a lot of people, it's not a whole lot of water, right? So switching out some of the beverages that actually have taste for water can be helpful. Now, what I like to tell my students is, and these are some signs of dehydration right here. I'm just kind of running through these a little bit faster now. And this is extreme dehydration when your urine changes color drastically, okay? However, if you're thirsty at all, you are technically dehydrated. And water is by far the best thing for that. Now, people like to talk about sometimes like Gatorade or Powerade. If you're talking about like an artificial sort of drink that actually helps with hydration, one particular one that I typically recommend is Propel. Propel is a lot better than Gatorade or Powerade in that way, and there's probably others as well. They're constantly competing, I'm sure there's others. But dehydration can contribute to fatigue pretty drastically. When you drink more water, I typically tell operators, if you start an actual regimen of drinking more water, it's going to typically take you about a month to experience the benefits that you actually start to notice drinking water helping you. But once you do start experiencing those benefits and continue to consistently do it, water is one of the better ways to combat fatigue. Okay, now, when you go on the internet, there's a bunch of different also like additional solutions, and these are great if you can implement them. I'm going to suggest something else though at the end here as I wrap up that I think is a little more important, gets more at the root of the problem. So there are fatigue risk management systems, including actual software that you can buy that helps with the monitoring of fatigue and suggesting solutions and things of that nature. A safety culture in general, a little bit along the lines of what Christy suggested, where there's certain kinds of options, but also there's just, it's in the air, right? Because when management talks about something, that it's out there now. And the things that supervisors or leaders don't talk about is obviously not being addressed. So everyone knows that when you drive or you operate heavy machinery or whatever, that fatigue is a potential problem. But often it just kind of stays in the back of your mind. Like, I've known that being too tired is a problem since I was a teenager and started driving. But there really isn't any additional talk about this. There's no additional solutions, there's no additional options, things of that nature. Policies for maximum numbers of overtime hours and consecutive shifts, which most agencies, in my experience, have. Implementing workplace sleep disorder screening and management programs. I mentioned the sleep apnea thing. That was a huge help for me when I was able to get on a sleep apnea machine. It really changed my life, actually. And I went from being a zombie or feeling like I was a zombie every day to being much more functional on a physical level. Okay? Providing worker training on sleep health and fatigue management. Obviously, that would have to come from the top down. Giving supervisors and workers fatigue symptom checklists and encouraging self-reporting. Part of the safety culture is that workers would have to feel like they can safely report being too tired in the first place. And either there's not going to be any negative consequences, or there's going to be some sort of a system like there is for lateness or sick days or short notices and things of that nature. Some sort of a system that says, hey, you have this many times of reporting, and then maybe this consequence happens if you continue to do it. Something like that, right? Some sort of like safety cushion that people are like, okay, I feel better about saying I barely slept last night and now I have this shift and I just don't feel safe behind the wheel. But I also recognize that you can't accept that excuse every single day, right? So there has to be some sort of a way for someone to feel like they can be encouraged to self-report. Now, the last thing I'm going to mention along these lines, something that I teach operators. There's a program that UTA does in general called Outward Mindset. And a couple of years ago, bus operations training decided, hey, we're not getting this out to operators that much, and there's certain things about this program that operators might benefit by. So I was tasked with kind of modifying this program, which is an external program from a place called the Arbinger Institute. They're kind of like a business consultancy firm that UTA uses. And I modified it for more like operator-specific things. So I just want to summarize a couple of things that I think are important. On the surface, it has nothing to do with fatigue, but it also has nothing specifically to do with anything. It's more about what it says, an actual mindset about things. And it's a mindset that can benefit both operators and those who oversee operators or who are adjacent to operators in some way. Okay? It's typically promoted as improving performance, enhancing collaboration, creating stronger relationships in the workplace. But I just want to get at a couple of bullet points about what I think it can do for people involved in this particular business. Okay? The inward mindset is being self-focused, whereas the outward mindset is being focused on the needs, goals, and objectives of others and yourself in the midst of others, right? So if you're an inward mindset person, you're very siloed from other people. You have your own goals and interests, and that's it. Other people are merely tools in order to help you get things or obstacles that are standing in your way. And not necessarily in a hostile way, right? It could be very subtle and unconscious. but it's very possible that you deal with people in that manner, including in your personal life, right? When we talk about outward mindset with operators, I emphasize 4 things. The first is introspection. So like this program helps people, and then operators in this particular instance, to think about one's own personal like motivations and drives, right? And that those are connected in particular to one's responsibility for one's entire life. The final point being that there's a uniformity between your personal life and your work life. Obviously, we have to keep those 2 things separate in a lot of different ways for various reasons. But at the same time, there are underlying things that don't separate themselves out just because we insist that they are, right? The way we treat people is one of those things. The way we think about people, the way we think about like an overall project or an overall vision that we're a part of in some fashion, right? And operators in particular, my experience has been, are often kind of both more connected to that vision because they have more face time with actual people, the people they transport, and less connected because they're not talking about the abstract, this is the vision sort of stuff. They're out there doing the work, right? And then there's support personnel. The support personnel is meeting in offices, and they're talking about this is what the vision is, and this is what the culture is, and things of that nature. And so there's kind of a disconnect between those 2 things sometimes. An outward mindset helps you to kind of put yourself in that bigger picture and take more personal responsibility. So my suggestion is, whether it's combating problems of fatigue or literally anything that happens to be a challenge within a particular field, that cultivating this sort of outward mindset is extremely helpful because it helps individuals think about their internal brain states, their motivations and desires in a more introspective way. And that promotes more responsibility, but it does the same thing for leadership. So if you happen to be a leader, you are under the same mandate as the people that you lead to be introspective in this way, right? To establish those kinds of relationships, to recognize the uniformity between work life and personal life, and to push the message out, right? That's one of the main things that a leader does, right? A leader is in charge of messaging. And often, so if fatigue is a problem, it's almost certainly not being talked about, and even if it is, there's nothing that's been incorporated into a program of any kind to address it, right? And so there needs to be some sort of a connection between personal responsibility on the part of those involved in actual safety incidents and how they're connected to the wider culture of this is what I can do about this, this is why it's important, this is why it should matter, right? Because in the end, it's all about convincing people that certain things matter. They're already convinced some things matter in their lives, obviously, but it's our job to be persuasive and to say, hey, this matters too, and I'm going to help it matter to you by proposing these possible solutions, by making it a part of the regular conversation, rather than just, hey, make sure you get enough rest and you're doing well in your diet, your exercise, and your personal life, no need to talk about it, right? There's a way of integrating those 2 visions. Right. Thanks.